All right. All right, so where are we today, right? I would say that we're seeing an explosion from when I first sort of submitted a proposal to talk about this back in January to now, right? To some extent, the internet has exploded, as other people have said before in this workshop. It's been growing for a long time. It's not like this is completely new, but the ramp up of information has been growing like crazy, right? And there's tons of different things, and we'll talk about more of those as we go through. I have seen a bit of an emerging pattern, and I'll give 3 examples in a minute. Pretty much every device has its own service in the cloud, right? The device reports data to the service, and users get their data through, basically through cloud APIs. So, I guess my animations didn't come in. All right, so Fitbit. My wife got me one for Father's Day, a fun Father's Day present, and I hooked it up to my iPhone. And that was great, right? And then, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, I bought an Android phone. So I downloaded the Fitbit Android application, and it said sign in with your Fitbit account. I did that, and voila, it synced. And my iPhone was, 25 feet across the end. I'm like, there's no way Bluetooth on my Fitbit's going to my iPhone, sending data to the cloud back to my Android device. What's happening, right? But I didn't have to do any pairing with my Fitbit. So to verify, I went and I shut off my iPhone, right? And then I said sync on my Android device. We're synced. Here's your battery status, here's your steps, here's all your stuff. The best I can figure, right, the Fitbit has some unique ID on the Bluetooth network, and when I log in to my account through the app, it downloads that unique ID, and then it goes searching on the Bluetooth network to see if it can find it. Hopefully there's some security there, but that's one example. Nest, they were at Google I/O talking about their API platform. Your Nest basically reports data up to the Nest cloud through some security mechanism that's better than OAuth, according to them. And then you access your data through OAuth, right? And obviously Google's looking at trying to build a whole ecosystem around these kinds of things. And finally, the Hue Light Bulbs. I spent some time talking to them at Google I/O as well, because they have a very lightweight communication between the light bulb and a hub called a Zigbee, and then that reports data, and you claim your device in a time-sensitive way, right? You push a button and connect to the light. Well, that connection to the light that you claim is basically sort of disconnected from the fact that the light bulb is known within the Hue network. So when I finally asked them, is it feasible if you want to that you could turn every Hue light bulb that exists blue, right? The answer is yes. So I'm coming at this from the perspective really of a consumer and as a user. So if we think about what, not so much from a business perspective, but from a user perspective, what do we want to happen? So you think about, I have a dishwasher, right? What are the things that you can know about me if my dishwasher is reporting data to your cloud, right? How often I wash my dishes, going to be pretty easy to figure out when I have guests because my dishwasher's running more often than normal. You can figure out when I'm not at home. Maybe you can even figure out with enough time when I'm canning stuff versus when I'm not, right? Maybe I wash all my canning, well, my wife loves to can, so maybe we wash all the canning jars on a particular cycle that we only use when we're doing canning, right? All of that data is going up in these emerging patterns to the cloud. And this bothers me, right? Because I don't really trust Whirlpool to keep all of this data secure in a way that, because that's not their business model. Their business model is not about how do I protect all this user data. Their business model is about selling appliances. So some of the challenges that we face, security, we've heard a lot about that today. Ubiquity and variety, data model. The data model one, we're going to spend some time on because I think it's fairly critical. And then user experience and management. If anybody was here in the last talk, Tim used the same article. If you haven't read Bruce's essay on the Internet of Things. It's worth reading. But basically, the key points he was making is that the devices that we have today are more powerful than some of the early computers, and they have all the same software vulnerabilities. In fact, they have more because of the layers of manufacturing that go on and where the software is applied, right? The people building that don't necessarily, they're not focused on how do I do software how do I have a software update mechanism in my dishwasher, right? So this is a big deal. From sort of an OSI stack, and my animations aren't coming through, I apologize. I really thought about it. It's three sort of layers that span the OSI stack. There's physical access, right? If you get access to my phone, right, what are the security aspects around that, and what does it matter? And they're all really related to levels of assurance, right? There's the network access. Tim talked about it from the perspective of a local network versus getting connected to the internet. What can I do if I can physically sort of network poke at the device? And then, of course, you have your sort of activity, right? If all of the data that I'm sending, all of my health data, even if it's integrity protected through signatures, is being sent over HTTP, right, I'm still vulnerable, right? So what is the sort of activity security that goes on? One thing I thought was interesting, and so here's this example from Samsung. I have one, and it has auto-updated its firmware 2 or 3 times already in the last 2 weeks, right? So now whether they're patching bugs or security vulnerabilities or whatever, I have no clue, but at least it's taken a model of that sort of software update, and I think that's an important thing for us to consider when we think about the Internet of Things. So what kinds of things? There are a huge array, and to some extent, I kind of feel like at times when we have these conversations, we're a bit like that old story of the 7 blind people feeling an elephant and each describing it differently. I was having a wonderful conversation at breakfast this morning, and it was taking a completely different track. I know other people are focusing on the Internet of Things within an industrial environment. And that's a whole nother sort of environment. The space is huge, and I think as we look through it, we're going to have to sort of try and figure out, what models make sense. I think data modeling is going to be fairly critical to getting a system that works, right? And so what are some of the things that we need to be able to do within the data model? Authorization, revocation. We don't often hear much about revocation. We hear about binding, but we don't really hear about the unbinding process. And I think that as you get more and more things, right, even as simple as my tea kettle's on my Internet of Things, and my friend wants to borrow the tea kettle, right? Well, what does that do? Do I leave it on connected to my set of things? Do I deprovision it and give it to them, right? We don't think about that in the sense of our daily user lives. So I think those are aspect things. Co-ownership, I think, is an interesting problem, right? Whenever we do data modeling and you look at the way people represent objects, right, and access to systems, co-ownership is a fun one to try and resolve. Grouping, aggregation, some of the Ranjan this morning in the first talked about basically grouping, and I think that's a critical aspect. So here's some questions that I came up with, and maybe we'll take some from the audience, right? How do I allow my son to change the thermostat but only within a limited range, right? How do I add a light bulb to the family room group, so to speak, right, and have it inherit the policy that is already assigned to the rest of the lights in the family room? Because I don't want to have to assign the policy every single time. I set up parental controls for my kids. Each kid has like an access list. And of course, 80% of the access list is the same because it's the family friends, right? And every time somebody new comes along and I got to go add it to 4 access lists, it's a royal pain, right? How do we make that kind of experience better, right? If I let my friend borrow my car and it's connected, right, what sort of data should I get about him borrowing the car? what data should he get from my car, right? And how do we sort of manage that? If I sell my washing machine, like the example of the tea kettle, right? How do I get it back? And then the final one that I think is interesting, if you think about it from the perspective of company A is going to build a service for their Internet of Things, and you've got to do it, you lose the ability to craft personal experiences, right? So here, World Cup game comes on, and the lights change to the color of my preferred team, right? And the TV tunes to the correct channel. Or maybe more appropriately, if my wife walks into the room, it basically automatically records the game and switches it to the cooking channel or something else, right? Right, how do you craft that that's personal to you? I think that there's a huge gamut of work that we're going to have to do in this area, such that it's not just about what someone else is dictating the functionality that I can do with my things, but how do I enable them to work together in a way that makes my life more enjoyable, my life more efficient.
Isn't if this, then that sort of person?
Yes, and I actually thought about snagging a screenshot to put in here. I think that is the first kind of thing along those lines. I think there's, all sorts of manners of visual programming and kinds of mechanisms that can be added. People can, but I like their concept of recipes and sharing of recipes, that kind of thing. But I think we'll need to see more of that in this space. So some key elements of usability, simple onboarding process, right? How do we get something into our cloud, so to speak? How do we group it? How do I pre-authorize it? If we think about policy, right, you don't want to have to individually assign policy every time. Authorization model. Centralized policy management, right? I want to be able to control all of the policy for all of my things in one place. I don't want to have to go to Nest to set up policy, and then go to Hue to set up more policy, and then go to Fitbit to set up more policy. I'd like to have all of that in one place. If some strange access, like somebody tries to access, sends my Nest a message and it's not authorized, right? How do I get that alert? Out-of-band user consent channels, right? Something's trying to access my network, should I allow it on? Those kinds of things. All of that, I think, is part of the authorization model. And then we've talked about deprovisioning. So this is some key aspects here on the deprovisioning. Basically is archiving of historical data, right? Like in the dishwasher case, I'm swapping out my dishwasher. Can I save my authorization policy, other things around what I've sort of configured my dishwasher to do, and apply that to the new one, and at the same time tell the old one, right, okay, reset yourself to factory default, so whoever gets it next, maybe I take it to Goodwill or something. Whoever gets it next gets it in a state that they can use it. So as we think about this sort of, my talk here, this is sort of to set up the context for an example and a way to think about this space. Next, we're going to move into sort of like, what are some of the standards that we have available to us in the sense of enabling or building solutions. And then we'll go through an example of how maybe one sort of way to think about it that might work. I will say again, this is very much from a user sort of centric perspective. Our conversation at breakfast was, largely centered around, is it even viable to build from a business model perspective? So it is setting the stake out there a ways, but I think from a user perspective, this is sort of what I would feel a whole lot more comfortable with. So what are building blocks, or the building blocks that I'm going to talk about today? OAuth 2. How many people know the sort of OAuth 2 flow and what it does? All right, that's sort of what I expected. All right, so we'll sort of breeze by that. OpenID Connect. I'll spend a little bit more time on user-managed access and the particular implementation or conceptual thinking around personal clouds that I'm going to talk about today that actually comes from work that Phil Winley's done with his organization. So OAuth 2, basically it's an authorization framework. You've got 4 actors: the owner, the person who sort of owns the resource. You have an authorization server. You have a client that is going to access the data at the resource server. And really, from an OAuth 2 perspective, where it came from is, I want to allow hikingtrails.com to be able to access my AIM data, my AIM buddy list, so that they can find other friends about me there, right? So George is both the client and the resource owner, and is authorizing, well, George is basically authorizing Hiking Trails to access the AIM buddy list, which is the resource server, right? So it really is sort of, well, what we say in the UMA group is Alice to Alice sharing, right? Or George to George sharing. I'm allowing someone else delegated access to my data. And that's really what OAuth 2 is about. One thing that's happening now, and I talk about this specifically because it relates to what I'm going to talk about later. OAuth 2 is actually in the very last stages of approving a dynamic registration spec out of IETF. And what that really is about is how can something sort of out of the blue connect to an authorization server and get OAuth 2 credentials. So in the OAuth 2 world, you have basically a client ID and some way to represent a client secret, which can be shared secret or PKI. And so this is a way for an entity to basically talk to an authorization server and get its credentials to use for future API calls. And basically, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can do it flat out open, just connect up, and maybe the authorization server will give you access, maybe it won't. You can basically tell your developer, here's a blob of data, send it when you make the registration request. And then there's this thing called a software statement, which is basically a signed JWT, if anybody went to Brian Campbell's talk this morning. And it's really simple. You call the register API at the authorization server. In this case, you can send in the example I have here is you can send in a software statement and claims. The authorization server processes that, and if necessary, gives you back a client ID and a client secret. For the rest of this talk, I'm using effectively OAuth 2's shared secret mechanism, just because it's easier, a little bit easier to grok the semantics. You can do this with PKI if you want to sort of raise your level of assurance, but for the presentation purposes, it's easier to think about it from a shared secret mechanism. OpenID Connect basically is an identity layer on top of OAuth 2. So we'll use the same sort of flow mechanisms and add effectively an ID token, sort of a signed statement about who the user is, not just what they're authorized to do. If you think about OAuth 2, it's really sort of an authorization statement that sort of combines privileges, the user, and the resource they're requesting, right? And it's sort of all jumbled together. OpenID pulls the user out and says, we'll make a separate statement about who the user is. That allows you to get user claims. It also supports session management and logout, which OAuth 2 has no concept of. So it really is trying to add an authentication layer on top of OAuth 2. All right. So UMA, user managed access. Really, the goal here is about how can I manage my policy, my authorization policy, in one place. At least that's the aspect of it that I'm talking about today. And we have the UMA originator in the audience here, so she will correct anything I say that's incorrect. It also is layered on top of OAuth 2. So the one big sort of new actor that UMA added that was really there in OAuth 2, but the community didn't really sort of acknowledge it, is the requesting party, right? As I said, OAuth 2 started from this perspective of George wants to allow some other service to access George's data, right? UMA comes in and says, okay, how can George allow Paul to access George's data? And do that in a way that I control the policy. I control the definition of what Paul has to do to prove he's Paul, all of those sorts of things, right? The rest of the actors are the same. And you can see that we've basically, from an UMA perspective, changed all of our terminology so that they map the OAuth 2. The only other sort of additional change is that in OAuth 2, the token is sort of issued by the authorization server and has a permission policy built in. In UMA, we have a separate token that effectively represents the requesting party, the resource server, the client, and the authorization server. So it effectively represents 4 parties, and then you basically present that to the authorization server, and it runs the policy across those 4 things to determine whether that request is allowed. And you'll see that a little bit. I have a flow here to sort of walk through how it works. From a sharing perspective, basically, what this really sort of amounts to is I want to be able to share information. I want to be able to create an URL. Here's my calendar, right? I want to be able to, it's not the standard today, which is the unguessable URL, right? But it's just a flat out URL, calendars.com/George Fletcher, right? And I want to be able to send it to anybody. And I want only the people that are authorized to be able to access it, right? And I want to manage that policy. Is proof of email address sufficient, right? Is it email address plus confirmed mobile number that I've programmed into the policy? Whatever, and the policies don't have to be user-centric. They could be device-centric, and we'll talk about that as we go on. But it's that kind of thing. So here's an example just to help give you a deeper flavor of how UMA works. Alice shares a calendar with Bob, and Bob basically adds it to his calendar software. So effectively, we've got 4 parties. I left Alice out just to make it a little bit easier. We've got Bob. We've got his calendar system, which is WorkCals. Alice's calendar system is CoolCals. And Alice uses her AM, some product called My AM, to manage the policy for the request. So it basically goes like this. Bob gives the URL that Alice sent to him in email to his calendar app. It says, I want to subscribe. Basically, this comes back and says, you're not authorized. You don't have any proof of who you are. Here's an ID to represent CoolCals, and here's the URI of My AM. Right, so effectively this is both a little bit of, well, there can be OAuth 2 dynamic client registration. I left that part out of this flow. But this is really a way for WorkCals to introduce Bob to My AM, right? By the way, in the bottom corner, you can see the spec references for what's happening from a step perspective. The next piece is just pure OAuth 2. As we said, UMA's built on top of OAuth 2. So I just do a standard OAuth 2 flow. Introduce Bob. Bob logs in at My AM. Let's say Bob logged in at My AM with his Google account, so My AM now has Bob's Gmail address, right? Now hold on to that thought for a minute, right? This is all standard OAuth 2, right? Basically, I get a code back. I exchange my code for an access token. UMA calls this the authorization access token. And it basically represents the relationship of Bob, WorkCals, and My AM. All right? Now, this is the part that I said earlier that UMA added. I'm going to ask for this thing called an RPT, which is a request permission ticket. And requesting party token. Thank you. See, I told you she'd correct me. Requesting party token. And basically, it's binding now CoolCals into the other 3, right? So now it gives me back my RPT. Now I go back and I say I want access. CoolCals says, is this RPT allowed access to Alice's calendar? And at this point, my AM runs the policy, right? It says, I know it's Bob, I know it's Workhouse, I know it's my AM. I know what policy Alice set for access to this calendar. It needed to be bob@gmail.com. Hey, look, I've got bob@gmail.com address from when he signed in. It matches. All right, I guess this policy is good to go. Give an OK. Now you get Alice's calendar, and it comes back to Bob. All right? So there's UMA in a nutshell. And so finally, in the sense of building for a better tomorrow, I want to talk a little bit about personal clouds. And this is, I have a couple links at the end. So if you are unfamiliar with Phil Windley's work in his Cloud OS, I might highly recommend looking at it. Basically, everybody can have a cloud. And clouds can, quote unquote, share objects. Everything in the cloud is based on this thing called a Pico for a persistent compute object. Effectively, the Pico has an identity. It has storage associated with it. It's basically an eventing entity that can receive events and process events and send events. It can effectively run rules or code. They have event channels that allow for basically point-to-point communication between entities. And if you want, you can program them with APIs to other things. They can also be distributed and decentralized. So if you wanted to, you could run them on your own hardware in your house, or you could run them on a hosting platform or split them. So they aren't bound to any one particular location. Talked a little bit about this. Basically, you've got functions, you've got rules, you've got persistent storage. There are a couple of examples that Phil uses when he talks. These notepad applications where basically the storage for your notepad application is your personal Dropbox, right? So the application runs, right, and you use the application, but it's not storing your data in their cloud service. It's storing it effectively in, quote unquote, your cloud service. And that kind of mentality is behind the Picos. I think the other really interesting thing to me about this is that it makes data modeling a lot simpler, right? If I figure that my phone might have a representation in my cloud, and my Fitbit might have a representation in my cloud, and my watch may have a representation in my cloud, right? I can then start to effectively aggregate and put these objects together and also allow for that more personalized experience that we talked about earlier, right? The World Cup events or things of that nature. I can model that because I have this concept of rules and functionality and processing in an entity in a system, as opposed to trying to put all of that logic and complexity into the device itself. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Programming model, pretty much you can program in anything you want. The only thing I would sort of add, this is Phil's slide, the only thing I would add here is, as I talk about Picos, instead of using OAuth 2 to access the Pico, we're using UMA. All right, which allows us to basically centralize the policy management across devices. Any quick questions before I move on to sort of the application section? All right. So here is my example to sort of walk through this morning. I'm buying a new garage door opener. It's a new connected garage door opener. And I already have a whole bunch of other stuff in my Internet of Things. And what I want to happen is when I drive in the driveway, the garage door will be up, right? Doesn't mean it has to go up. It just needs to be up, right? So here's a way to think about the data model. I have an owner Pico. In this particular example, the owner Pico basically functions also as a UMA authorization server. And you'll see that as we go through. And then I have these other Picos scattered around that are connected to their devices. As I thought about working through this, There are a couple of things that were important to me. One of them was trusted introduction, so you'll see how that works, or at least my concept of it. Obviously, we need transport security, activity authorization, and all of those things, transport security, activity authorization, we can get from OAuth 2 in UMA. I'm not going to explicitly talk about OpenID Connect in this particular flow, but I think that there are going to be devices that are very identity-centric, user-centric, in which OpenID Connect makes sense because you are binding an identity to it. In other cases, there isn't so much of an identity to the device itself, and OAuth 2 in that case may be sufficient. As I said just a minute ago, owner Pico functions as the UMA AS. Each Pico will function as an UMA client. And so effectively, when it goes to determine whether an inbound request has authorization, right, it'll use the UMA protocol flows to say, does this inbound request with its RPT, is it authorized to perform the action that's being requested? A smartphone app, which will function as an UMA client and is also sort of a trusted agent. And then this last part is this tight binding between device and Pico, and whether you want your device to actually potentially host the Pico or to actually just have a very tight binding between the device and the Pico itself, I think gives some flexibility, at least in the early stages as we figure things out, to potentially represent a different mechanism of connections. But you'll sort of see some thoughts here. Again, this is, sort of a theoretical possibility. All right, a few more assumptions based on the OpenID Connect client dynamic registration. We're going to manufacture these devices with a software statement. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I want in that software statement. The concept here is, from a manufacturing perspective, it shouldn't be difficult to assign something into the device and have that be sufficient for it to effectively bootstrap itself onto any network. All right, and you'll sort of see some thinking there. The device supports some sort of bidirectional connectivity. It doesn't have to be NFC. It could be Bluetooth. It could be, Tim was talking about Thread. It could be anything. I just used NFC in this example. We need to protect the data, so HTTPS, though you probably could, if you really wanted to, use message encryption as another way to protect. It's really, this requirement here is about transport security in a smartphone app. The software statement, basically what we want is an issuer claim, and all of this is straight out of the spec for a JWT, a signed JWT. Again, if you went to Brian's talk this morning, this probably makes sense. If not, get the slides. But basically, we need an issuer claim to identify the manufacturer, a subject claim that's effectively the quote-unquote identifier for the device, a JWT claim, which is basically unique to this instantiation of the software statement, may not be required, but it might be useful for replay kinds of cases. And then some sort of device type. I don't know that we need an explicit industry-wide taxonomy of device types, but you need some way for the overall system that's going to get this software statement on a client registration call to be able to sort of guess as to what should I add it for. And this is really about user experience, right? If my UMA authorization server gets a request to add a device to the network, right, it would be nice if it could go, oh, this is a light. So, the prompt to me is, which room is this light going in, right? Or maybe if it knows I'm standing in the family room, would you like it to add it to the family room light, right? It's really around user experience and convenience. And then this last part is basically just that since the JWT, the software statement is signed, you need to be able to get the public key to verify the signature. So from a user experience perspective, right, what would I like to see, right? The user takes their smartphone app, right? They tap the garage door opener. The garage door blinks some LED, right, that says, I'm connected, right? My personal cloud app on my phone shows that the garage door is now connected, and I can query it for the state of the garage door, whether it's up or down, and I can open and close it, right? From a user experience, That's simple, straightforward, shouldn't be too complex for most people to get. How do we make that work? How am I doing, Paul, on time? Good? 15? All right, I think we're good. All right, so first, when we at the NFC tap, since that was what I was using in this example, right? The device transfers the software statement to the phone, and the phone transfers basically the endpoint of the owner Pico, right? This UMA AS to the device, right? So effectively, it's a way of doing trusted discovery. Potentially, you know, there's network credentials if this thing's going to connect via Wi-Fi or some other mechanism that need to go there. All right, but that's basically the data transfer. The software statement to the phone gives basically the endpoint of which UMA authorization server to talk to. All right, so now what the phone's going to do, the phone's basically going to pre-register the device, passing the software statement down saying, hey, the user wants to add the garage door opener to, you know, my Internet of Things, right? And in this case, the question goes back, do you want to add that to your house, right? As opposed to maybe a detached garage or, you know, but you don't really want to add it to the family room aggregation object, right? Now, obviously, in this case, you might be able to bypass this question, but you sort of get the idea, right? User says yes, so now the owner basically sends a message to the house Pico basically saying create a garage door, right? So now we're sort of dynamically creating our data model of Pico objects, right? And again, the house can verify that it's the owner using the UMA flow, right? We have basically said all messages are authorized using UMA. So now we create the garage door, right? And we establish a connection, basically one of these Pico channels between the house and the garage door. So now there's a way for the house to talk to the garage door. And you'll see why that becomes important later, right? And so we have our connections. What does the garage door do now that it basically gets the endpoint for the owner Pico, right? This UMA AS server it needs to talk to. Well, first, it basically uses the UMA discovery mechanism to find out the client registration endpoint, and then it dynamically, do I have that here? Basically, it then, once it does the registration, the discovery, right, because it knows what's endpoint. By the way, UMA discovery just uses the IETF host meta mechanism to retrieve a JSON object of defined endpoints and other configs about that UMA implementation. It basically calls the OAuth2 client dynamic registration call, and it passes that software statement. So this register device is really the OAuth2 client dynamic registration call, passing a software statement. Right? Now the owner AS can basically match this request for a device joining the network with the pre-registered software statement that came in from the smartphone, the trusted app, and go, yes, this device is allowed on the network, right? Because we don't want the, I don't know if you guys remember from last year, right? There was this big article that the Russians were accusing the Chinese of sending them tea kettles with basically malware embedded in the tea kettle, so it would hack into the Wi-Fi networks. But you don't want any old object that can find some endpoint to be able to join your Internet of Things. So that's basically, that software statement match allows you to verify that this request to get credentials to operate on the network is a trusted one. So what we send back is, okay, yes, we've registered you. Yes, you're allowed on. Here's your OAuth2 client ID and client secret. All right. Now, basically, I need to get an access token. So all standard, normal old OAuth, right? I just use the client assertion flow. I sign it with my new client secret, right? It knows who I am. I get back an access token, and this effectively functions as that UMA AAT that we saw in the previous UMA flow, right? So now I have an access token, an OAuth2 access token that I can use. By the way, this OAuth2 access token, again, because of the trusted introduction, because it's UMA that's managing, and because of the way that we aggregated it, there's already pre-authorized policy around that UMA access token, right? So we don't have to ask the user, no user consent of should the XYZ be able to whatever, right? You can manage that up front. Now basically we go back to UMA and we say, in this case we're basically saying, okay, I need to establish a channel because I want to be able to talk to my garage door Pico over there. So this is a bit of a provisioning API call. This actually doesn't exist in any standard. So this was something that I sort of added in the process of trying to walk through this and make it work. So basically I get the endpoint in the Pico, and now basically I need to get a UMA requesting party ticket to be able to authorize my request to establish a channel with the garage door Pico, right? Because again, all the Picos are UMA clients. They're going to authorize every inbound request. So it's already pre-authorized. That it should be able to talk to that. It knows who it is. Now I can establish the connection. So effectively, where are we? Right? We got ourselves our garage door connected to its Pico. All I had to do was tap it with my phone, right? And the policy for who's allowed to open the garage door, shut the garage door, control the garage door is effectively managed in one central place by my policy. I can control that. And of course, the goal is that we can open the garage door when we drive in the driveway. So this actually then, once we have our data model and our connections, this is actually very simple, right? A lot of the car, either manufacturers or devices, basically have geofencing capability, right? So I have a geofence around my house, right? When the car crosses the geofence boundary to inside the boundary, right? All it needs to do is send a message to its Pico saying, I'm inside, right? It sends a message to the house Pico saying the car is home because not only do I want the garage door up, but maybe I want the TV tuned to this channel and I want these lights on and, oh, by the way, start the coffee and whatever else, right? So it sends a message to the house Pico saying I'm home, right? Car's home. The house then basically sends a message to the garage door saying make sure the garage door's up, right? The garage door Pico knows the state of the garage door. So if it's already up, it doesn't need to do anything. If it's closed, of course, it raises the garage door. So, and there's the final message. If I need to decommission the garage door, right, via my phone or some other mechanism, right, I can tell the owner Pico to basically remove the garage door. And then, you can sort of follow the chain of messages down to the house, down to the garage door. The key here is that this garage door, the Pico that represents the garage door can basically archive any data about that particular functioning device, right? And basically tell it, because it has a trusted connection, right? Tell it, reset yourself to factory defaults. And now I can take the garage door down and hand it off to somebody else or take it to the dump. So benefits, basically all the collected data and access policy and management is under the user's control, right? It's not getting sent up to the Nest cloud or the Hue cloud or the Fitbit cloud or somebody else's cloud. I as a user am not having to manage authorization policies spread across who knows how many clouds to get this to work, right? It's all centrally managed in one place. And my supposition here is that we could probably build this with today's standards, maybe a few extra things we need to tweak here and there. But a lot of the functionality that's needed to enable this kind of capability is already in existence today. So I have a bunch of references in the spec, in the deck here to things that were used for this talk. When it goes up, you'll be able to link to them. And, well, anyway. Eve and Domenico helped me with some of the UMA stuff, and Phil, of course, with the CloudOS slides. So, any questions? And then I have one final comment when we're done. Yes?
Looking at that diagram, one of the thoughts that passed through my head was, unless Alice is attending this conference, one of the key challenges that I see us having is making that experience as almost, I mean, to say it needs to be easy is almost a cruel understatement.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
I concur completely. I think that we have to get to a model. That's why, to me, the trusted introduction is so critical, because it makes a lot of that easy. You know, some representation that systematically you can figure out what kind of a thing it is, where it needs to go, what you need to do, what the default policies are. All of that stuff needs to be there, because you're not, a user does not think about managing it in this way that we think about it, in the sense of detailed data models and connections between things. They just want it to work. And if it gets very complicated, they're just going to bail. Yes?
Is there, have you contemplated, is there going to be ultimately some kind of subordinated data structure where maybe the first light bulb in the room next to the rest of the light bulbs in the room don't connect, they have parent-child relationships?
So yes, I think with this kind of a model, you could model that, right? And to some extent, right, the owner Pico doesn't interact directly with the garage door, right? House is the object that does that. You could set up, if you wanted, a primary light bulb, right, and then connect all the other light bulbs to it, so that a message to the primary basically gets cascaded to all the secondaries. The fun part there is if you need to replace the primary, how do you pick the secondary, right? And sort of the standard, fault-tolerant failover problem. So, but again, that comes down to sort of a data modeling problem, and I think that depending on what the exact use case or problem domain is, the way we model things will be different. Paul, did you have a question?
Just wondering, the trusted introduction, the tap mechanism, thoughts on how introducing different devices might have different requirements for how you authenticate to the phone?
Interesting question. I suppose that's possible from a policy perspective. Did you have a comment on that, Eve?
Yeah, I thought about that. There's a little profile that Mike Schwartz has written on top of Uma for trusted elevation. So it could be that if an initial resource owner is trying to provision a downstream requesting party, which may be the person in that situation, with access, it might demand that they have a certain strong authentication or high assurance.
As George showed it, though, the user didn't interact directly with the authorization server.
Right.
They were never taken to the authorization server. It happened through the credential flow. Right.
So, I mean, I think you could still do that, right? If you know what the device type is, right? You could and the trusted app is interacting with the authorization server, you could go, oh, for this device, you need to add the fingerprint to it, right? So you could still come back, and that's sort of outside the scope of the UMA spec. That's basically between this trusted app and the UMA authorization server, sort of added on value.
That's sort of, trust establishment, like happens off stage, something.
Sorry.
Okay. Just wondering, does Pico remember the state of the device? In your example, that knows the vertical is open, is closed. How they have an exception? But let's give example. Let's see that as a Pico policy saying that if I leave a house home at 9 o'clock, as soon as I park on the garage door, shut on the garage door. But meeting my dog trying to get into the garage, the safety feature is also up, so the garage door is open.
Right.
People know the state.
Yes. So the expectation there is that the device itself and its sort of online representation, those are always in contact. So whenever the garage door goes up, it sends a message to the device Pico that says, I'm up, right? So if the Pico told it to go down and it started to go down and then the safety feature kicked in and it went back up, it would send a message back saying the state is up. Right? So now the garage door Pico knows it's up. So you could apply some rule that says try again 2 times, or if it's up and when it was supposed to go down, notify, send a message, an SMS or a push notification to the owner saying that the garage door is up when it's not supposed to be, right? All of those mechanisms are available.
So those exception rules for the kickoff exception workflows, will that be part of Pico as well?
Yeah, yes. I think it would be part of the rule that basically says it should go down, right? would then look for the current state, right? I think if you were telling the garage door to go down, you'd want to verify that it went down, right? So your rule might say, okay, in a minute, check to see if the garage door is down. And if it is, right, then I'm good and I'm done. But if it's not, start the error flow.
So how is the adoption of the concept of Pico in the market?
That's an excellent question. I don't think it's huge by any stretch of the imagination. This is sort of what Phil Windley's company, Kinetics, is trying to do, is to get this model. I really like the model from a privacy perspective and from a data modeling perspective, which is why I wanted to use it in this talk. But I don't think there's, sort of like wide industry adoption behind it. I would say the current emerging patterns are all get a device, get it connected to the internet, make your own cloud, try and make as much money off the data analytics as you can, and give the user some functionality so they want to give you their data. That's somewhat cynical, but that's sort of the way I see it at the moment.
Well, I can see good application for your screen that you have especially medical devices, meaning a lot of the ability to control how the function associated with the session of the user, that people those are shared devices for patient in and out.
Mm-hmm.
So I need those kind of capabilities. I'm wondering if Centralized other vendors, not just researchers,
Right.
about this model.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, I'd encourage you to talk to Phil. And I mean, it's running, it works. In fact, he's releasing a product for cars in the next month or so called Fuse. So if you look for joinfuse.org, I think it's .org, you can look up, this in all of the sort of car, the way the car interacts is based on this underlying cloud OS mechanism. Yes, they're in the back. Sorry, you had a question.
You use the word policy quite a bit. And there's, even in the simple example here, you can imagine cases like, my son can put down the garage door or raise it as long as it's before sunset and he's not away at college. Okay? Any thoughts about how we implement that in a standardized way? Say no, let's talk about it later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's lots of work going on. There's some stuff in UMA that's looking at some of that, but I don't think there's any clear standard yet for how to do that, and definitely not from the perspective of a user. Do we have time for one more question, Paul?
To that,
Okay.
I think you would standardize mechanisms by which you can refer to yourself, but how you capture that policy is somewhat important.
In UMA, it's not on the wire.
Right.
I think that Exactful actually has the best chance of being a kind of portable declarative policy format you could use. I'd love to see it cut down to use cases like this. Make the XML equivalent of Exactful versus the SGML that it is today.
Did you have a question?
Yes.
Uh,
Browbeating them for some years.
All right. One right over there next to you. He's had his hand up for a while. Sorry.
So the example dealt with managing the device's access to your personal cloud and also policies so you can control the device. You can tell me if this is out of scope, but can I just log in my neighbor's garage if it's open, just tap on the garage door opener and then gain control of it? Or from at a dinner party, just tap on all the devices at their home and just gain control of all these devices? Or is it like, is it physical access is game over? Is it different from like a wall safe where I get to the wall safe, then I have a...
Right. I think those cases are things we're going to have to work through. Obviously, you don't want physical access to be game over, right? In the sense, I mean, to some extent, if the device is already provisioned, for sure you couldn't provision it again. I think that's relatively easy to understand, right? The device knows I'm connected to a Pico, so if somebody comes and taps me, I just sort of ignore it until somebody tells me to deprovision. I ran into this problem specifically with Apple the other day because the logic board in my wife's laptop went bad, and could I deauthorize my computer, my laptop, my wife's computer before the logic board went bad, so that when they replaced it, it didn't tell me I was over my limit of 5? No, right? So I mean, there are cases like that, but I think you could do things on that side. If it's an unprovisioned device that's sitting in the home that hasn't been connected yet, right? Yeah, we might need to think, we figure out what, You know, is there some proximity or is there some other thing that makes sense? I did not go down that far down this path.
You can imagine some sort of reputation metric, right, where that app had been used to trustingly introduce other devices, and it was able to introduce them.
You didn't get the latest version. Bummers. All right. All I was going to say is I had this really cool picture of Midway Falls. So get out and go explore. Unreal, if you want to see it, I'll show it to you on my laptop. But really cool stuff in the area. So don't get too embedded in the stuff. Go to all the sessions, be good, you know, good players of the conference, but definitely get out and explore.
My apologies, it even says V2. That was supposed
Yeah.
to be the latest
Well,
release.
I should have labeled it V3, and then it would have been a naming problem.
We're presenting off my laptop, not the shared file.
No worries.
No other questions?